Corporate Heir laughed during his hearing. Judge Caprio's response silenced him. Tuesday, March 12th, 2024, 9:15 a.m., Manhattan Supreme Court. The grand doors of the courtroom swung open and Nathaniel Cross entered as if the room existed solely for him. 26 years old, impeccably groomed, dressed in a navy bespoke suit tailored to the contours of his body, silk tie knotted with precision, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. His hair, dark and deliberately tousled, caught the light, framing a face that had never known consequence beyond the occasional reprimand from a board meeting or a parent's sharp word. He offered a half smirk to the gallery, a gesture meant to charm, to assert dominance, to remind everyone of the cross-tech fortune waiting silently behind him. The gallery shifted uneasily. Journalists lifted pens, microphones leaned forward, and whispers threaded through the audience like static electricity. The Cross family sat in the front row, stiff-backed and expectant. At 58, Judge Caprio's presence was the antithesis of Nathaniel's world. Calm, deliberate, eyes scanning every person in the room with a precision honed over decades. He did not flinch, did not react to the subtle arrogance radiating from Nathaniel, yet the weight of his authority pressed down, almost imperceptibly, on every corner of the room. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet finality of truth. "You are a citizen first," Judge Caprio said, turning Nathaniel's smirk into a flicker of discomfort. "We will proceed as such." Nathaniel's laugh, a short, dismissive burst, broke the silence. Not loud, not obnoxious, but sharp enough to cut through the clerk's steady voice reading the charges. Reckless corporate negligence, resulting in an explosion at Crosstech's 14th Street laboratory. 2 employees injured, 1 hospitalized for third-degree chemical burns, and extensive property damage tallying over $1 million. To him, these were numbers on a page, abstract inconveniences, not human lives disrupted or endangered. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his legs with deliberate nonchalance, glancing toward the reporters with a faint nod that seemed to say, "See? They still notice me." Yet the murmurs in the gallery told another story. Lab technicians, neighbors, employees from Crosstech, even casual observers in the public seating, faces flushed, brows furrowed, eyes tracking every twitch, every breath of the air. They sensed the tension between expectation and reality, the collision of privilege and law. Behind him, the Cross family's patriarch, Gregory Cross, shifted uneasily, adjusting his cufflinks, eyes darting to the judge, as if pleading silently for intervention, for reassurance that the family's influence still held sway. The clerk's voice carried on, detailing the extent of the explosion. February 8th, 2024, 8:43 p.m. An unauthorized chemical experiment escalating beyond protocol, containment. Failure, emergency response activated within 12 minutes. Nathaniel's laughter punctuated certain lines, a faint scoff at phrases like endangerment of personnel and violation of occupational safety standards. The judge's calm gaze never wavered. Nathaniel noticed finally that the courtroom's collective focus was not on his suit, not on his family's fortune, not on his carefully curated image. The law was indifferent to wealth, indifferent to name recognition. "Mr. Cross," Judge Caprio said, folding his hands neatly on the bench, "this court will not be swayed by status, nor by the power of inheritance. Every individual is measured by the same standard." Nathaniel's eyes flickered. A subtle tightening of the jaw betrayed a momentary self-awareness he had rarely encountered. He had walked into boardrooms, charity galas, and political fundraisers assuming control, assuming authority, assuming compliance. Here, authority did not bend. Here, compliance was earned through truth, through accountability, not lineage. A reporter in the front row scribbled rapidly. Another whispered to their colleague, "Did you see that smirk? He actually laughed at the charges." The words traveled through the room like wildfire, eyes narrowing, conversations tightening. Nathaniel could feel the shift, a faint but undeniable tension, as if the air itself demanded acknowledgement. And yet, he persisted in his demeanor, a carefully constructed wall of entitlement and amusement. He tapped his fingers on the armrest, almost imperceptibly, letting his eyes drift toward the ceiling. The courtroom did not recoil, did not accommodate him. Instead, it simply waited. Each tick of the clock, each rustle of paper, each breath of the audience weighed heavier than the last. Nathaniel, for the first time, sensed a force more immutable than his inheritance, a force unyielding to wealth, to charm, to influence. By 9:42 a.m., the gallery was fully engaged. Every whisper, every glance, every suppressed intake of breath, a testament to the silent conflict between inherited power and the impartial authority of law. Nathaniel Cross, corporate heir, laughed and smirked, but beneath it, a subtle tremor of awareness began to creep in. He had entered expecting dominance. He would leave realizing that in this courtroom, no fortune could shield him from consequence. The first chapter of reckoning had begun. February 8, 2024, 7:18 p.m. The city streets of Manhattan were slick with rain, and a faint haze of exhaust hung in the air as emergency responders arrived at Crosstech's 14th Street laboratory. Two employees lay injured from a chemical spill, their uniforms scorched, eyes wide with disbelief and pain. By March 12th, in case Chivra 2024 CV 1792, the courtroom buzzed with tension as Nathaniel Cross, 26, leaned back in his chair, fingers drumming lightly on the polished oak armrest, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. The charges detailed the reckless negligence, OSHA violations, chemical containment failures, and $1.2 million in property damage. The clerk read aloud the timeline. At 8:43 p.m., containment protocols were bypassed, leading to an uncontrolled chemical reaction. Emergency response was activated 12 minutes later. Two employees suffered second and third degree burns. Damage assessed at $1,245.17. Nathaniel exhaled, a short, incredulous laugh escaping him as if the words were a comedy routine. 1.2 million, he muttered under his breath, and they still think I'm responsible. His lawyer's hand rested briefly on his shoulder, a silent signal to temper the performance. But Nathaniel shook it off. The gallery, employees, neighbors, journalists, felt a collective chill. Privilege met the impartial law head-on. Judge Caprio's eyes, steady and unflinching, swept across the courtroom. "Mr. Cross," he said, voice deliberate, "in this courtroom, wealth does not equal innocence. Every individual stands equal before the law." The words were simple, yet they carried the weight of decades spent dismantling ego with precision. Nathaniel's smirk faltered, a subtle twitch at the corner of his eye betraying the first hint of disquiet. He tilted his head slightly, feigning casualness, but the tension was palpable. This was the first direct confrontation between inherited power and unyielding justice. The first witnesses were lab technicians, young and nervous, eyes flicking between the defendant and the judge. One, Maria Santos, age 29, hands trembling slightly, recounted the moments before the spill. "We tried to follow protocol," she said, voice steady but strained. "But the new experiment parameters weren't properly approved. I warned Nathaniel's team multiple times. Emails, calls, ignored. They told us it was handled. I didn't think it would escalate like that." Her gaze dropped to the floor, nails pressing into the bench as if physically holding herself together. Nathaniel leaned back, smirk lingering, whispering to his attorney about overdramatic employees. A city inspector, Gerald Klein, age 52, took the stand next. His voice carried the calm authority of experience. "We received pressure to sign off on inspections faster than protocol allows. Calls from executive assistants, subtle hints about family connections. It's hard to convey the weight of that expectation without sounding alarmist." He paused, letting the words sink in. Two employees were injured because corners were cut, and attempts were made to obscure emails and documentation. A collective murmur ran through the courtroom. Nathaniel's fingers tapped impatiently, a microcosm of entitlement meeting moral scrutiny. The exchanges grew sharper. Nathaniel's laughter punctuated certain questions. "So, you're saying because a few emails weren't answered immediately, I'm personally at fault?" His tone dripped with sarcasm. A reporter scribbled frantically, noting the audacity. Judge Caprio did not flinch. "Responsibility is not a matter of convenience, Mr. Cross. Decisions have consequences, regardless of the sender's email response or family name. Nathaniel exhaled sharply, shoulders tightening, a subtle sign the veneer of control was starting to crack. The gallery reacted in quiet waves. Some employees whispered to each other, fear and vindication mingling. Others, journalists, scribbled furiously, sensing the story unfolding in real time. Entitlement challenged, facade exposed. Nathaniel's father, Gregory Cross, sat rigidly in the front row, hands clasped, jaw set, every inch the figure of wealth attempting to influence by presence alone. He avoided eye contact, as if the calm authority of the judge could not be swayed by ledger books, donations, or boardroom power. By 10:32 a.m., the courtroom had settled into a rhythm of tension. Witnesses detailed attempts to pressure oversight agencies, emails deleted or altered, phone calls placed to inspectors. Nathaniel's sarcastic commentary persisted, a shield against accountability, yet each word was met with Judge Caprio's unwavering gaze. The moral clash was stark, inherited privilege colliding with structured justice. Every laugh, every scoff, every dismissive glance emphasized the arrogance of youth and fortune, yet the law's impartiality remained resolute. As the session drew toward a brief recess, the emotional weight of the testimonies lingered. The gallery exhaled collectively, the contrast between Nathaniel's arrogance and the victim's measured recounting of fear and injury hanging heavily in the air. Nathaniel rose, stretching with exaggerated casualness, but the eyes of the courtroom followed him like a tide refusing to ebb. For the first time, he felt the pressure not of auditors, not of shareholders, but of truth staring directly at him. The chapter closed on the silent, almost imperceptible moment where entitlement met its first real barrier. Laughter had collided with accountability, privilege with principle, and the outcome remained suspended, a moral equation only time, evidence, and justice would resolve. The courtroom exhaled as the recess bell sounded softly, preparing the stage for the next act: exposure, a reckoning, and the unmasking of arrogance in the face of immutable law. March 14, 2024, 10:40 a.m. The courtroom hummed with quiet anticipation, the polished benches reflecting the pale morning light streaming through the tall Manhattan windows. Officer Lydia Marks, 34, approached the stand with measured steps, a folder clutched tightly to her chest, eyes scanning the room as if preparing for every reaction, every ripple of tension. "Good morning, Your Honor," she said, voice steady, though there was a tremor beneath it, born of years witnessing consequences unfold. Judge Caprio inclined his head, expression unreadable. "Proceed, Officer Marks." She opened the folder, sliding precise documentation across the surface, revealing the depth of the lab incident at Crosstech's 14th Street facility. Her first words cut through the room like a scalpel. At 8:43 p.m., February 8, 2024, a chemical leak was detected. Gas concentrations reached 200 parts per million within 10 minutes. Evacuation protocols were initiated 12 minutes later. 2 employees sustained chemical burns. Tony Ramirez, age 19, with burns covering 15% of his body, and Carla Duvall, age 37, covering 22%. The figures were clinical, yet the weight behind them reverberated through every person present. Tony Ramirez, barely out of adolescence, sat rigid in the gallery. His hands were trembling, clasped together as if holding himself upright. I couldn't breathe properly," he said, voice hoarse. "We were told it was under control, but the air, it burned my throat. My eyes, I couldn't see. I thought I was going to die." His gaze flicked briefly toward Nathaniel Cross. The young heir reclined in his chair, fingers lightly tapping the polished armrest, lips curved into a faint, dismissive smirk. There was no acknowledgement, no empathy, only the aura of inherited immunity. Carla Duvall, single mother and sole provider for her 10-year-old daughter, spoke next. Her voice was taut with fatigue and fear. "I lost 2 weeks' pay because of this. The burns. They're healing. But I wake up in the middle of the night, thinking about what could have happened if I'd been alone in the lab. I keep imagining Tony, imagining anyone else, and knowing someone tried to hide reports. It makes it worse." Her hands trembled as she held the folder of medical bills and documentation, eyes briefly glancing toward the gallery, then locking on Judge Caprio. The courtroom felt heavier, every breath measured. Nathaniel shifted in his chair, a subtle roll of the shoulders, lips pressed into a controlled line. Yet the smirk remained. He whispered to his attorney, "They're making a mountain out of a molehill, as if distance, wealth, and name could erase the lived terror of these individuals." A faint stir went through the audience. Muted gasps, exchanged glances, subtle shakes of heads. Privilege, so often invisible, was now glaringly tangible against the human consequences laid bare. Officer Marks continued, her voice steady but layered with urgency. Internal emails show attempts to delay OSHA reporting, instructions given to subordinates to withhold documentation, and pressure applied to inspectors to minimize the severity. These were not isolated oversights. They were coordinated attempts to obscure accountability. She paused, letting her words sink. Every eye in the gallery, every reporter's pen, every neighbor's whispered murmur absorbed the moral weight. The city itself felt the tension, as though Manhattan's crowded streets outside had shrunk to a single, focused courtroom. Tony Ramirez swallowed hard. I can't go back to work yet. Every time I see the equipment, I remember the panic, the fire alarm, the smell of chemicals. It's like it won't ever leave me." His voice faltered, tears threatening, but not yet falling. Nathaniel's eyes flicked toward him, brief, calculated, and then away, dismissing the human reality as if it were an inconvenience. Carla's gaze never wavered from the judge. "I trusted the company to follow rules to protect us. That trust, it's broken. And now my daughter, she doesn't want me to go back to work. She's scared I'll get hurt again." Her voice cracked on the final words. Silence enveloped the courtroom. Even the murmurs of reporters had stopped. This was the human toll, raw and unfiltered, standing stark against the sterile numbers of damage and repair. Judge Caprio's expression remained calm, yet the moral pressure radiated through his measured tone. "These are not abstract figures," he said. "They are people, lives disrupted, pain inflicted. Accountability cannot be deferred by wealth or position." Nathaniel leaned back slightly, exhaling as if preparing to counter, but his usual smirk was less assured, a flicker of discomfort betraying the first real sense of exposure. The gallery exchanged quiet, loaded glances, community members beginning to see the tangible consequences of corporate arrogance. Employees who had feared retaliation now felt their courage reflected in Tony and Carla's testimony. Reporters scribbled feverishly, capturing the unfolding narrative of power clashing with human reality. Nathaniel's attempts to diminish the impact, the laughter, the whispered dismissals, began to feel hollow. By the time Officer Marks concluded, presenting charts of chemical dispersion, evacuation timing, and injury reports, the courtroom had transformed. It was no longer a place for corporate spin. It was a stage for truth, for fear confronted, for accountability demanded. Nathaniel's posture stiffened slightly, fingers pressing harder on the armrest, as if attempting to anchor himself in the face of a narrative he could not control. The chapter closed on the quiet tension after Marks's final words. The air was thick with unspoken recognition. Privilege did not protect against the human cost of negligence. The victims' stories lingered, echoing in the minds of every spectator. Nathaniel sat absorbing, or at least encountering, the first true collision between entitlement and consequence. The next act, systemic exposure and moral reckoning, loomed. The weight of the human lives involved pressing forward, demanding acknowledgement and justice. March 15, 2024, 11:05 a.m. The courtroom seemed smaller than usual, every polished surface, every wooden rail, feeling amplified under the weight of scrutiny. Nathaniel Cross sat with his legs crossed, silk tie slightly skewed, fingers drumming lightly on the armrest. The morning sun cut through the blinds, casting thin stripes across his tailored navy suit. But even the warmth of light couldn't soften the rigid composure of Officer Lydia Marks as she stepped forward, tablet in hand, a quiet authority radiating from her. "Your Honor," she began, voice steady but edged with urgency, "we have obtained records indicating private communications between the defendant and multiple city officials in the days following the February 8th incident." She tapped the screen, and emails and call logs appeared in the gallery's view. Timestamps, phone numbers, and short, insistent messages requesting delayed inspections, reduced fines, and minimized public reports. The numbers were precise. February 9th, 2024, 7:12 a.m., a voicemail to the Manhattan Department of Environmental Safety. We'd appreciate a softer approach. This is a minor issue. February 10th, 3:47 p.m., an email to the city's OSHA liaison. Consider timing on the inspection. Our internal review is ongoing. The air in the courtroom thickened, a tangible pressure pressing down on every shoulder. Nathaniel's jaw tightened as he leaned back, trying to maintain the casual nonchalance that had long shielded him from accountability. "It's routine," he said under his breath, a faint, dismissive smirk curling his lips. "Business as usual." Judge Caprio's gaze held him like a steel trap. "Mr. Cross," he said, voice calm but cutting, "attempts to manipulate inspections and influence penalties will not be tolerated. In this courtroom, wealth does not equal innocence." The words hung in the air, striking against the polished veneer of privilege. Nathaniel's fingers clenched subtly, and for a brief moment the smirk faltered, revealing the first crack in his cultivated armor. Carla Duval, seated with her daughter beside her, rose. Her voice, though quiet, carried the weight of weeks of lost wages, hospital visits, and sleepless nights. "Mr. Cross," she said, looking him directly in the eyes, "because of the delays you pressured for, I missed work for 3 weeks. My daughter had to sit in a hospital waiting room alone while I tended to chemical burns that weren't my fault. We trusted the company to follow rules, and someone used power to make sure it didn't." Her fingers gripped the strap of her bag, knuckles white. Her gaze did not waver, even as Nathaniel shifted uneasily, eyes darting to the floor before returning reluctantly to hers. A murmur rose in the gallery. Witnesses whispered to one another, heads turning toward the young corporate heir, who had long relied on the shield of influence. Reporters scribbled feverishly, capturing the emotional charge. The courtroom was no longer a static room. It was alive with moral energy, every whisper and glance amplifying the gravity of privilege, colliding with consequence. Nathaniel's attorney leaned forward, attempting to interject, but Judge Caprio raised a hand. "This is not merely about fines or procedure," he said, voice unwavering. "This is about the human lives affected. You may find wealth convenient, Mr. Cross, but it will not obscure accountability here." The young heir's face hardened, the smirk now faint, replaced with a tension he could not fully mask. He cleared his throat. I was only trying to protect my company," he said, voice tighter than usual. "We weren't trying to," Carla interrupted, her voice rising slightly with the weight of unaddressed suffering. "Protect your company? My daughter couldn't sleep for weeks. I couldn't work. We were at the hospital at midnight because of your lab. Do you even see us?" Her words were raw, ringing with frustration and moral clarity. The courtroom fell into silence, every heartbeat measured, every witness absorbing the confrontation. Nathaniel's lips pressed together, a subtle tremor in his lower jaw betraying the first inkling that arrogance might not survive this scrutiny. His father's presence at the back row offered no shield. The political influence that had always buffered him seemed impotent under Judge Caprio's unwavering gaze. The young heir's eyes flicked to the judge, then to Carla, and for the first time there was hesitation, a pause that carried more weight than any words could. Officer Marks added quietly, "The emails show coordination with executives to obscure facts. Professional courtesy was extended, not in good faith, but to manipulate perception. These are deliberate actions, not errors." The courtroom absorbed the evidence, and Nathaniel's posture stiffened further, shoulders drawn tight. His confidence, cultivated over decades of inherited privilege, was under assault. The gallery's energy shifted palpably, a low collective hum of indignation and tension. Observers leaned forward, murmuring, exchanging glances that mirrored the ethical gravity unfolding. Nathaniel exhaled slowly, a small, almost imperceptible crack in the facade, as if the weight of real accountability had finally begun to press against the carefully constructed armor of entitlement. By the end of Officer Mark's testimony, the courtroom had transformed. Whispers of outrage became quiet acknowledgement of moral reckoning. The human stories, Carla's voice, the precise evidence of obstruction, all converged to puncture the illusion that wealth could render one untouchable. Nathaniel sat rigid, eyes fixed but distant, beginning to understand, perhaps for the first time, that arrogance alone could not mask the obligations owed to those harmed. The chapter closed with a palpable tension, a sense that the next revelations would further strip away the protective layers of power, forcing a reckoning he could no longer defer. March 18, 2024, 11:05 a.m. The morning light had just begun to filter through the tall windows of Manhattan Supreme Court, brushing the wooden panels with a muted warmth that contrasted sharply against the tension thickening the air. Nathaniel Cross sat rigid in his seat, fingers intertwined over his knees, gaze fixed ahead with the kind of taut composure that had long been his shield. His eyes flickered occasionally to the gallery, where families, colleagues, and city officials watched silently, their anticipation nearly audible. The room seemed to shrink as Tony Ramirez, 19, a lab assistant whose life had been irrevocably changed, rose from the witness stand. His shoulders were straight, posture careful, carrying the weight of trauma with quiet dignity. On February 8th, Tony began, voice steady but threaded with tension, the explosion didn't just destroy property, it could have ended me. A pause, just long enough for the words to hang and reverberate, filling every corner of the courtroom. He spoke of the initial crack of glass, the hiss of escaping gas, the alarm that reverberated through the hallways, and the chaos as his co-workers scrambled toward the exits. I felt exposed, vulnerable. I thought I wouldn't make it out, Tony said, eyes locking briefly on Nathaniel, whose face remained outwardly calm but betrayed small, nearly imperceptible tremors. A jaw tightening, a subtle downward tilt of the head, an almost silent exhale. The smirk that had often lingered on his lips was gone, replaced by a tightening that hinted at recognition, however tentative, of the human consequences of his choices. Carla Duvall, 37, a single mother, watched Tony quietly, tears welling but restrained, a testament to the strength demanded of her daily life. When it was her daughter Lily's turn, the atmosphere thickened further. 8 years old, clutching a folded letter with careful, small hands, she approached the stand. Her voice was soft, measured, but carried a clarity that cut through the courtroom like sunlight through fog. Mr. Cross, she began, reading carefully, I want you to understand. I was scared. I didn't sleep. I didn't know if my mommy would be okay. Please make sure no one else feels this way. The innocence of the child, combined with the weight of moral clarity in her words, sent a ripple through the gallery. Whispers arose, not in disbelief, but in a collective acknowledgement of the human cost that no amount of wealth or influence could erase. Nathaniel's eyes flickered down, scanning the letter as if reading each word carved into his conscience. A subtle exhale, barely noticeable, escaped him. His shoulders slumped fractionally. The courtroom felt the shift, micro-expressions in his face, a tightening around the lips relaxing, the downward gaze replacing a once defiant stare. The control he had wielded for so long, the shield of privilege, seemed suddenly insufficient against the moral weight now pressing upon him. Judge Caprio leaned forward, voice calm but deliberate, threading authority and moral weight together. Mr. Cross, he said, the law addresses negligence and liability, but there is a greater responsibility that transcends statutes. You cannot measure your actions only by penalties or corporate risk. There is a human cost that demands acknowledgement and ethical response. Accountability is not just a word in a legal brief, it is a principle that defines character. The silence that followed was profound, every heartbeat in the room audible in its collective intensity. Nathaniel shifted, lips pressing into a thin line, the first tremor of genuine reflection appearing in his posture. I understand, he said finally, voice low but carrying a weight that hadn't been there before. I accept responsibility, not just the legal aspects, but the ethical failure, the negligence, the harm caused to Tony, to Carla, to Lily, to everyone affected. I will participate in restitution programs, oversight committees, and lab safety initiatives to ensure this never happens again. His eyes met Tony's briefly, a flicker of remorse surfacing, fleeting yet unmistakable. Tony nodded once, a subtle acceptance in his expression, acknowledging that the confession, though overdue, was a step toward repair. Carla's hand tightened around Lily's as if to anchor her in the unfolding shift, and the gallery exhaled collectively, sensing the first cracks in Nathaniel's facade of invulnerability. The energy in the courtroom had transformed. What had begun as arrogance and deflection was now breaking into the uncomfortable but necessary territory of accountability. For the first time that morning, Nathaniel's posture softened. The rigid line of his shoulders loosened slightly. The clenched hands over his knees shifted to a more open, almost tentative resting position. The air, still thick with tension, carried a different charge now, one of moral reckoning, of the weight of privilege meeting the clarity of human consequence. Judge Caprio's gaze remained unwavering, a quiet affirmation that justice was not merely about punishment, but about the recognition of harm and the commitment to prevent its repetition. As the chapter closed, the courtroom settled into a reflective silence. Nathaniel sat, no longer simply a symbol of inherited power, but a man beginning to confront the tangible consequences of his actions. The pivot was subtle, internal, but palpable. Arrogance had met accountability, and the first step toward transformation, however tentative, had been taken. The scene was set for the months ahead, where the demands of restitution, ethical oversight, and personal reflection would challenge every assumption Nathaniel had ever held about his immunity and privilege. March 20th, 2024, 2:30 p.m. The grand clock in the Manhattan Supreme Court ticked steadily, its rhythm filling the courtroom as if counting down not just time, but the weight of justice itself. The gallery was packed. Family members, lab staff, city officials, reporters, all waiting for the moment that would define both a legacy and a lesson. Nathaniel Cross sat rigid in the defendant's seat, a figure carved from privilege and confidence, yet under the scrutiny of an authority he had long assumed could be navigated through wealth alone. His bespoke Navy suit hung on him differently today. The confidence that had once radiated from his posture now carried a subtle tension, shoulders squared but slightly inward, hands gripping the edges of the polished oak bench. Judge Caprio cleared his throat, the sound low but carrying the weight of absolute control. "Mr. Cross," he began, voice deliberate and measured, "your actions on February 8th, 2024, led not only to material damage, but to human suffering. 2 lives were scarred, families disrupted, and trust eroded. The law requires accountability, but justice demands more than fines and procedural compliance." The courtroom was silent, every listener acutely aware that the words were aimed not at abstract guilt, but at a young man who had once laughed through the reading of his charges. Caprio's eyes met Nathaniel's, unwavering. "Therefore, the court orders that you spend the next 6 months working full-time in the affected labs under direct supervision, participating in cleanup, safety audits, and daily operational oversight. You will experience the environment you once disregarded, and you will confront the consequences you previously mocked." A faint shift ran through the gallery, murmurs of approval, restrained but tangible, signaling the beginning of communal validation. Nathaniel's fingers twitched, his jaw tightened. He swallowed slowly, a thin line of awareness dawning that this punishment was not abstract. It was immersive, inescapable, and transformative by design. Caprio continued, voice firm, resonant. "Additionally, you will contribute $500,000 in reparations to the families directly affected, compensating for medical expenses, lost income, and the emotional distress endured. You will also attend ethics and mentorship programs, guiding young lab managers in the principles you once neglected, reinforcing a culture of responsibility where you once wielded privilege carelessly." The words hung heavily. For the first time, Nathaniel's eyes wavered, his usual smirk replaced by a constricted humility. The weight of restitution, ethical guidance, and human repair pressed against his carefully constructed armor of entitlement. Across the room, Carla Duvall and Tony Ramirez exhaled in unison. Carla's hands squeezed Lily's, who sat quietly beside her, eyes wide yet bright with a dawning sense of vindication. Tony's lips were pressed tightly, but his shoulders sagged slightly with relief, the first release of tension after weeks of testimony and hearings. The courtroom energy shifted, collective awareness settling into the reality that accountability was not merely symbolic here. It was tactile, immediate, and morally resonant. Nathaniel's inner monologue began to churn, a mix of disbelief and dawning comprehension. He had always believed wealth could shield him, influence could bend outcomes, and status could render him untouchable. Yet now, confronted by the structured rigor of a sentence that forced engagement with the very consequences he had once ignored, he felt the first tangible sting of genuine consequence. Cleaning labs, observing protocols, attending workshops, guiding younger staff, these were not experiences cushioned by assistants or lawyers. These were experiences of immersion, reflection, and tangible restitution. As Caprio's gavel fell, signaling the formal conclusion of sentencing, the murmurs in the gallery swelled into restrained, collective acknowledgement. Nathaniel rose, moving slowly, each step measured, his expression tight, eyes avoiding the gallery, yet unable to escape the weight pressing on him. The previous arrogance, the casual smirks and scoffs, had given way to a constrained humility, faintly visible in the subtle hunch of his shoulders, the careful modulation of his gaze. He exited the courtroom not in triumph, but under the unspoken gravity of moral reckoning, a young man confronted directly with the principle that wealth and status cannot substitute for responsibility. Judge Caprio remained seated, silent for a moment, allowing the import of the sentence to resonate throughout the room. His eyes scanned the gallery, resting briefly on each victim, each witness, each observer. Justice, he reminded all, is not simply the meeting of punishment, it is the tangible repair of harm, the reaffirmation of communal values, and the insistence that accountability leaves a trace beyond legal papers. The courtroom exhaled, the energy shifting from anticipation to reflection. Outside, the city continued in its unrelenting rhythm, but within these walls, a precedent had been set. Privilege could be challenged, arrogance could be tempered, and the human consequences of choices were finally being acknowledged. Nathaniel's departure marked not an end, but a beginning. A 6-month journey loomed ahead, one that would test not his bank account or social standing, but his capacity for empathy, responsibility, and transformation. In that moment, he left the courtroom visibly changed, not free of pride, but curiously lighter under the weight of accountability. The sentence had not just punished, it had set in motion the subtle, demanding work of redemption, a work that would ripple through the lives he had affected and through the conscience of a community watching justice unfold in real time. By early April 2024, Nathaniel Cross's mornings began before dawn. At precisely 6:45 a.m., he would arrive at the 14th Street lab, the streets still damp from overnight rain, the air sharp with spring chill. His tailored suits had been replaced by work overalls, sleeves rolled, hands coated with the lingering grit of industrial cleaning. At 7 a.m., under the watchful eyes of lab supervisors, he scrubbed counters, calibrated safety instruments, and logged chemical inventories with meticulous care. Every adjustment, every routine inspection was performed under the dual pressure of scrutiny and self-awareness, each action a quiet acknowledgement of the negligence he had once dismissed. Initially, his colleagues watched with thinly veiled skepticism. Interns whispered in hallways, noting how Nathaniel's wrist flicked instinctively at a loose valve, how he hesitated slightly before offering instructions. For him, each small task carried the weight of moral accountability. Cleaning a spill, inspecting storage units, double-checking venting systems. He did not merely follow orders, he confronted the reality of the harm caused, the chemical fumes, the potential accidents that could have ended a life. The work was physically demanding, but the psychological weight was heavier. The hum of ventilation systems reminded him of the 12 minutes that had forced evacuation in February, and the echo of the explosion haunted each corner of the lab he now cleaned diligently. Rain-soaked mornings became a ritual of humility. Gloves soaked, boots muddy, Nathaniel felt the sting of exhaustion seeping into his muscles and his conscience alike. When a sprinkler malfunctioned or a chemical measurement required repetition, he remained No assistance, no status to shield him, just his own diligence and mounting respect for those who had borne the risk without privilege. "We appreciate that you're taking this seriously," one technician murmured one morning, eyes wary but observant. Nathaniel nodded, hands on the rim of a sink, the water dripping down his arms. "I have to," he replied softly, tone stripped of arrogance, voice low enough for only a few to hear. In that moment, the sentence was no longer a legal imposition. It was a lived truth. Journalists and neighbors initially reported with skepticism. Headlines suggested a reluctant heir following orders, a public figure performing accountability for optics rather than conscience. Yet over weeks, subtle signs emerged. Nathaniel's corrections were precise, never patronizing. He stopped interrupting interns mid-instruction, choosing instead to guide through questions and suggestions. His gaze, once dismissive and smirking in court, now lingered on the faces of his colleagues, registering concern, fatigue, and achievement. Ethical reflection began to emerge in brief, almost imperceptible admissions. "I should have seen the hazard," he would tell supervisors after a drill. "I should have ensured the protocol was followed, not delayed." No one prompted him. These were voluntary acknowledgments of prior failure, raw and unembellished. Victims, cautiously observing from the sidelines, began tentative interactions. Carla Duvall, who had spent months negotiating medical appointments for Lily while balancing work, now found Nathaniel at the lab, not in courtroom robes, but scrubbing and organizing the same spaces that had caused fear. Her initial glance was neutral, her expression guarded. Yet over time she noted the consistency, the same arrival time, the same diligence, the same absence of avoidance or pretense. When Lily visited the lab one afternoon to see her mother's work environment, Nathaniel knelt briefly to show her a safety panel, explaining in clear, patient terms why certain protocols mattered. Lily's small nod, a mixture of understanding and tentative approval, marked a subtle but significant human bridge being rebuilt. Weeks turned into months. Nathaniel's presence became predictable, almost ordinary, yet remarkable in its sincerity. Supervisors recorded changes, attentiveness, empathy, and reflection replacing prior arrogance. His mentorship of interns was deliberate, emphasizing safety, awareness, and the human stakes behind laboratory operations. When a minor spill occurred, Nathaniel was the first to step forward, supervising containment and then reviewing preventative measures with young staff. Each act of accountability compounded, reinforcing that transformation is measured not in moments, but in repeated observable choices. The local press, initially skeptical, began chronicling these changes. Reports highlighted his engagement, thorough completion of safety drills, careful guidance to interns, and voluntary contributions to lab safety meetings. Comments from lab employees described a man learning responsibility in real time, grappling with privilege in a meaningful way, and acknowledging the human impact he once ignored. Social perception shifted subtly but undeniably. Skepticism faded into curiosity, then cautious respect. Community members, from neighbors to small business owners, began recognizing the work not as punishment endured, but as service earned. By mid-June, Nathaniel's transformation was no longer anecdotal, it was observable. The man who once laughed through hearings now arrived in the lab with purpose, hands and sleeves marked by labor, posture grounded by accountability. Victims spoke briefly with him, sometimes sharing concerns, other times offering tentative gratitude for his consistent presence. Tony Ramirez nodded to him in the hallway one morning, eyes steady, the unspoken acknowledgement clear. Effort matters, consistency matters. Restitution is not a fleeting gesture, but a lived commitment. Through rain, cold mornings, and unrelenting oversight, Nathaniel's ego softened, replaced by a tangible awareness of the stakes his negligence had carried. The community witnessed not just the act of punishment, but the labor of redemption. Change, it became clear, was not granted by court orders alone. It was earned through sweat, reflection, and relentless engagement with the consequences of one's choices. In the quiet of early mornings, amidst the clatter of glass and metal, a young man was learning, slowly but genuinely, what it meant to bear responsibility. By summer, the narrative had shifted. Nathaniel Cross was no longer only the wealthy heir who mocked authority. He had become a symbol of earned accountability, a man whose transformation had been painstaking, observable, and morally instructive. Each scrub counter, each guided intern, each deliberate safety check resonated beyond the lab walls, showing the community, victims, and the courts themselves that redemption is neither instant nor superficial. It is sustained, laborious, and profoundly human. By September 2024, the streets surrounding 14th Street Lab had begun to feel different. The tremors of the February explosion had faded from concrete and brick, but not from memory. Families who once walked cautiously past the facility now did so with measured confidence, buoyed by visible signs of change and accountability. Carla Duvall, once hesitant and guarded, returned to her lab work with a quiet poise. Her steps were purposeful. Her smile, rare yet genuine, reflected regained confidence. Gone was the anxiety that had marked her every decision after the chemical spill. She moved through her workspace with authority, guiding colleagues and ensuring procedures were followed, carrying not just professional competence, but the reinforced knowledge that accountability mattered, that justice had tangible meaning in her life. Tony Ramirez, the young lab assistant whose burns had scarred both body and memory, had found his own path toward healing. He no longer avoided the lab, but instead returned with a sense of purpose that few would have predicted months earlier. Assigned to mentor the newest cohort of interns, Tony's eyes, once wide with lingering fear, now held steady determination. He demonstrated containment drills with precision, emphasizing safety over speed, and constantly reminded interns that their vigilance could prevent catastrophe. Each measured instruction, every reminder to double-check equipment, resonated with the weight of someone who had stared directly at danger and survived. In guiding others, he reclaimed control over a space that had once held terror, transforming trauma into teaching, fear into foresight. Lily Duvall, now 8, had been deeply impacted by the accident that nearly upended her life. The school she attended had instituted a safety awareness program inspired directly by the lab incident. Teachers wove lessons of chemical safety, emergency response, and situational awareness into daily routines, ensuring that no child would encounter similar peril unprepared. Lily's voice, once shaky and timid when recounting the explosion in letters to the court, now contributed confidently to group discussions, demonstrating an understanding of both personal safety and community responsibility. The ripple effect was palpable. One child's fear had been transformed into knowledge, empowering her peers and creating a culture of vigilance that extended beyond her classroom. Meanwhile, the legal and journalistic communities had taken notice of the ongoing aftermath. Law students at New York universities had begun drafting case studies on Crosstech's ethical failures and Nathaniel Cross's path to restitution, exploring the interplay of privilege, responsibility, and redemption. Professors highlighted the nuanced lessons of moral reckoning, systemic oversight, and sustained accountability. Journalists tracked Nathaniel's progress closely, noting his consistent participation in safety workshops, public forums, and ethical discussions. Their reports shifted tone from skepticism and criticism to cautious acknowledgement of genuine change. Headlines no longer painted him solely as a reckless heir, but as a man confronting the consequences of power and privilege, actively working to mitigate harm he had once ignored. Nathaniel's involvement in public forums marked a profound turning point. On Tuesday mornings, he attended sessions where citizens, community leaders, and students asked pointed questions. He answered directly, without deflection or pretense, acknowledging both past failures and present commitments. "I cannot undo the harm caused," he would say, hands resting on the podium, voice steady yet measured. "But I can ensure it does not happen again, and I can contribute to preventing it for others." Citizens noted the sincerity in his demeanor, the absence of self-interest, the willingness to listen, and the clarity in his acknowledgement of privilege. These interactions, public and scrutinized, became microcosms of accountability in action, transparency, humility, and service coalescing to restore faith in a system previously marred by negligence. Neighbors began to report a renewed trust in local oversight agencies. The agencies themselves, reinforced by both public scrutiny and the procedural consequences imposed on Crosstech, tightened compliance, demonstrating responsiveness that had been previously absent. Street-level safety inspections, previously perfunctory, were now thorough and respected. And the community recognized that justice had extended beyond the courtroom, permeating the systems designed to protect them. Parents spoke to teachers with renewed confidence. Workers discussed protocols with serious attention, referencing both the lab incident and the accountability measures Nathaniel had undertaken. A sense of shared vigilance replaced prior apprehension. By autumn, the case had transcended individual punishment. Nathaniel's 6 months of labor, oversight, and restitution had become a living example. That accountability, when genuine and sustained, could catalyze growth and restore trust. Carla's return to confident work, Tony's mentorship, and Lily's empowered learning were concrete markers of this transformation. Public forums, student engagement, and active journalism ensured the lessons remained visible, resonating beyond the confines of legal documents and courtroom transcripts. The community, once fractured by fear and doubt, now observed the power of justice entwined with personal responsibility. Every procedural review, every mentor-led drill, and every citizen question reinforced a collective understanding. Justice is not merely punitive, it is restorative, preventative, and educational. Nathaniel's journey, painstaking and public, had created a ripple effect, touching lives that had been directly harmed and influencing the broader societal structures that govern safety and accountability. By the end of September, the streets, schools, and workplaces around 14th Street Lab reflected this shared recovery. Conversations in cafes, parent meetings, and student groups spoke of vigilance, responsibility, and communal resilience. Nathaniel's presence, no longer a symbol of entitlement, became one of possibility, the embodiment of a difficult but real transformation, a reminder that justice paired with earnest action can restore not only individual integrity, but public trust. The case had evolved into more than a legal precedent. It had become a living testament to the idea that accountability can extend outward, creating ripples that heal communities, empower victims, and reinforce the societal belief that power without responsibility carries inevitable consequences. By March 2025, the echoes of the courtroom had long settled into memory, yet their resonance remained alive in unexpected ways. Nathaniel Cross sat in the quiet of his Manhattan apartment, pen in hand, journal open on the oak desk his father had once admired for its prestige more than its practicality. He wrote slowly, deliberately, each word carrying the weight of months spent in accountability and reflection. The ink traced the contours of humility he had never known before. "I thought wealth could shield me," he scribbled on March 3, 2025, "but it only magnified my failures. I understand now that privilege is not protection. It is responsibility." He paused, fingers tapping lightly against the page, remembering Carla Duvall's trembling voice, Tony Ramirez's steadfast gaze, and the silent determination of 8-year-old Lily reading her letter in court. Each memory pressed upon him a lesson carved in human cost and moral clarity. Across town, Judge Caprio reflected on the case in the pages of the New York Legal Review, her voice measured but firm as she discussed the intersection of power and responsibility. "Society entrusts us with authority," she said, "yet when individuals wield influence without conscience, they erode the very foundation of trust upon which justice stands. The lesson is timeless. The law cannot merely punish, it must illuminate the moral compass that guides our actions." Her words resonated beyond legal circles, rippling into classrooms, boardrooms, and community forums where the Crosstech case had already become a reference point for ethical deliberation. The judge's perspective highlighted a universal truth that Nathaniel had begun to internalize. Accountability is not just a moment in court, but a continuum, a thread linking past mistakes with the ongoing effort to restore integrity. Citizens, too, carried their reflections forward. In neighborhood coffee shops, parents spoke with a new certainty about safety measures, inspired by the diligence that had followed the lab incident. Teachers discussed risk protocols with students, emphasizing preparedness as much as education. City inspectors recounted the increased respect and rigor their teams now received, no longer met with casual dismissal from executives, but with attentiveness and cooperation. Public sentiment shifted from skeptical observation to cautious appreciation of tangible change. The community had internalized a vital lesson. Justice coupled with accountability could transform not only individuals, but social systems, restoring faith in institutions that once felt distant or indifferent. For Nathaniel, reflection extended beyond public perception. He documented his emotional and ethical growth, chronicling moments of discomfort and discovery. He recounted the earliest days of lab supervision, how cold mornings and repetitive tasks stripped away arrogance, leaving only the raw contours of effort and responsibility. He wrote of small victories, earning the trust of interns, receiving nods of recognition from supervisors, and watching victims cautiously acknowledge his presence without fear or resentment. Each note reinforced the realization that transformation was neither instantaneous nor performative. It was earned through consistency, reflection, and empathy. Universities and corporations began to formalize these lessons. Ethical case studies emerged, analyzing Crosstech's initial negligence, the legal proceedings, and Nathaniel's structured path toward restitution. MBA programs and law schools dissected the human consequences of unchecked privilege, framing the narrative as a cautionary tale of power, moral blindness, and the potential for redemption. Nathaniel's journey became both subject and object of study, a living example of the philosophical and practical dimensions of accountability. Classrooms buzzed with debate, students probing the tension between legal compliance and ethical responsibility, connecting historical theory with contemporary lived consequence. The broader societal takeaway crystallized in conversations between citizens, journalists, and policymakers. Accountability, when executed with both firmness and restorative purpose, had a multiplying effect. It encouraged community vigilance, inspired systemic improvements, and validated victims' experiences. Justice had not ended with a sentence. It had begun a process, one that integrated reflection, societal participation, and ethical education. The narrative of February 8, 2024 and its aftermath now served as a collective mirror, revealing both human fallibility and the capacity for meaningful change. In his journal, Nathaniel paused to capture the philosophical insight that had grown alongside his practical responsibilities, that the law is not merely punitive, but a conduit for moral development, that power without conscience corrodes, and that humility, hard-earned, reinforces the social bonds upon which civilization depends. He wrote, "To hold privilege is to hold duty. To fail in duty is to fail humanity itself. Justice is not a final sentence. It is the daily act of choosing accountability over convenience, empathy over entitlement." The words lingered on the page, a testament to a journey that had begun in arrogance, passed through exposure and reckoning, and arrived at reflection and purpose. March 2025, in this sense, was not an end but a philosophical vantage point. Citizens, victims, and institutions had observed the arc from entitlement to transformation, and the resonance of that arc continued to shape expectations, behavior, and culture. Nathaniel's story had become a living framework for understanding the balance of stern justice and restorative practice. It illustrated that when consequences are coupled with deliberate growth, the moral and social fabric is strengthened. In the silence of his apartment, he closed the journal, eyes lingering on the city skyline. The lesson was clear, immutable, and shared. Accountability, humility, and conscious action possess the power to restore trust, guide conscience, and transform both individual lives and the communities they touch.